Continuem amb un dels temes que més preocupa la professió perquè amenaça no només el periodisme, sinó la democràcia mateixa. I ens fixem en primer lloc en dades que han sortit aquesta mateixa setmana, estem parlant de l'última enquesta del CEO, són dades molt d'actualitat, que diuen que el nivell elevat de pensament conspiranoic afecta un terç de la professió, un terç de la població, perdó. Un de cada 3 catalans tenen un nivell alt de pensament conspiranoic i el 79% dels encastats creu que els mitjans de comunicació censurem informació important. La desinformació s'ha convertit en una pandèmia global que nega els fets contrastats i que a la vegada fomenta el discurs de l'odi. I per parlar-ne, el tenim aquí, hem convidat tot un expert que en una entrevista a La Vanguardia va dir el mes de gener que avui la mentida surt barata i rendible en política. Ser periodista és també desmentir. Lucas Graves és investigador i s'ha especialitzat en la verificació i en la mentida. Conversarà amb Carme Colomina, investigadora del CIDOB i antiga presidenta també de l'Associació de Periodistes Europeus. Per cert, que l'APEC acaba de llançar justament el Premi Talent Jove de Periodisme Europeu, que vol reconèixer articles publicats o pendents de publicar fets per joves sobre Europa. Si en voleu més informació en podeu trobar a la web de l'APEC i també a la web del col·legi. Carme, Lucas, tot vostre. Un aplaudiment per ells.
Moltes gràcies, bon dia a tothom i benvinguts també a aquest diàleg sobre desinformació i pandèmia global. Ja hem començat molt forts aquest matí parlant de tots aquests canvis, aquesta acceleració del periodisme i realment com aquesta transformació de les eines, aquesta transformació digital està afectant la nostra relació amb els continguts, la nostra relació amb la veritat, la nostra relació fins i tot amb els mitjans de comunicació. I d'aquesta idea d'acceleració i de canvi real és una de les coses que volem parlar aquest matí amb el Lucas Graves. Ell és ara investigador de la Carlos III de Madrid, també del Reuters Institute, de la Universitat d'Oxford. Va ser un dels pioners, estava a l'avantguarda ja de la investigació sobre el fact-checking, sobre la verificació en publicacions. El seu llibre va sortir ja el 2016 i ara està completament volcat a estudiar quina és l'evolució precisament i com s'han d'adaptar els verificadors, aquestes plataformes de verificació, a aquests canvis, a uns canvis que estan marcats, entre moltes altres coses, per la intel·ligència artificial. De fet, ho comentàvem ahir quan preparàvem una mica aquesta sessió, aquesta sensació que tinc quan la comunicació oficial de la Casa Blanca ja es dedica a elaborar vídeos en intel·ligència artificial, generats per intel·ligència artificial, on tens el president dels Estats Units com a papa, com a rei o com a milionari en un resort a Gaza. Quina és la importància, el pes de la veritat en tot això i com hi podem fer front? Aquesta és una de les preguntes claus que parlarem avui amb el Lucas Graves. Thank you, good morning and welcome. We will have this conversation in English, but then we will have also time for questions. So thank you, thank you for being here. I was mentioning already this idea of AI and the impact on the acceleration of disinformation, and also the European Parliament, in fact, talks about disinformation as a systemic threat to our environment. But how can we deal where we stand now when we talk about the importance of facts, when we have these so strong tools where facts doesn't matter anymore, it's just how you can force them or turn them into something new?
So first of all, thanks very much for that, what sounded like a very generous introduction. I can't fact check it.
They will for me afterwards.
So the question of how sort of AI transforms the landscape of disinformation is, I think you're right, the most urgent one that we're sort of facing right now. And first of all, I think anyone who's being honest with themselves has to admit that in some ways it's too early to say, right? We're in the earliest days of really what could be a profound transformation in the ways that we communicate, in the ways that we inform ourselves. And this is, of course, after 20 years of very rapid and very profound change in how we communicate and how we inform ourselves. So I think it's quite difficult to say what the world of communication and news and disinformation is going to look like in 5 years or in 10 years. However, I think there are at least sort of two broad concerns, two broad avenues that we can point to today where AI, large language models, are already transforming sort of the world of disinformation. So the first one is that obviously using these large language models makes it possible to produce, fake images, fake stories, fake news on just a vast industrial scale, much more quickly, much more efficiently than before. Now that can be sort of hard to imagine because it's already being produced on a vast industrial scale, quite often, whether funded by states or by commercial interests, quite often by very poorly paid workers, in large rooms, just churning out fake posts, fake images, scams to try to, convince you to give them your bank account, etc. Doing this all day long. But now that kind of work can be automated very efficiently, so it can be done much more quickly. And it's not only about the volume of disinformation that's produced, it's also about the ability to keep refining the technique automatically based on signals that come from the real world. So how many people clicked that link? How many people opened that email? How many people shared that fake post? All of that can feed back into the AI program to help generate the next round of false messages. Basically, any way that you can imagine AI changing what the marketing and advertising industries do is also going to apply to propaganda and disinformation. And as we know, many times, new techniques are innovated precisely in those shadier industries. So that's one set of concerns. Another one is, of course, what we hear about all the time, the sort of concern over what we call deep fakes, which is these increasingly realistic images and audio and video clips that you can produce just by giving some instructions to a large language model, and you can generate increasingly a convincing fake video. This capability is improving so quickly. It's fairly stunning. I mean, what the newest models can do in the last 2 months is already much, much better than what they could do a year ago. These sort of characteristic flaws that used to give it away increasingly are not visible anymore, so it just looks more and more realistic. The irony is that realism has never been especially important to disinformation, right? We know from the last 10 years that you can have incredibly crude, really badly made fake news stories, fake images out of context, etc., that perform incredibly well. They're shared millions of times. They become kind of a cultural story, a cultural meme, and presumably they have influence. So in some ways we can debate, well, how much of a difference does it make if you can do this more convincingly? But the concern is, of course, that a really well-timed fake video released, say, just before an election, when there's not time to verify it, and imagine, the media report on it, and then it raises some new doubt, and that actually directly influences the political outcome. We've already seen some cases where there's been concern that this was happening. And of course, there's what is sometimes called the liar's dividend, right? This is an even more sort of dangerous impact, which is that 10 years from now, if we're surrounded by the sea of really, really convincing fake images and videos and audio, what does that do to real evidence, right? Maybe we just begin to diminish our trust in even professionally produced images, professional evidence from news organizations, and so on. So that's a real concern. I said that there were two big avenues. Mm-hmm. I'll say one more thing. I think the biggest concern in the long run is kind of what artificial intelligence does to knowledge-producing institutions in general, right? So journalism, academia, scientific disciplines. I mean, already universities are being challenged incredibly in their sort of day-to-day operations by AI. What do universities look like 10 years from now? What does scientific publishing look like 10 years from now? As someone who does a lot of peer review, I can tell you, everybody knows this, you already see how many papers are being generated with AI, and then you see how many other peer reviews are being generated with AI. So it's just a fundamental challenge to all of our systems for validating and credentialing knowledge. And that's kind of frightening, but I mean, I think that's the biggest question that we're facing in the long run.
So this is the evolution of disinformation or the content manipulation, but how is fact-checking adapting to that? Because they are also forced to cope with these new trends.
So fact-checking is really changing at a tremendous pace. I always have to sort of remind myself, it's hard to remember, but fact-checking as we know it is only 20 years old, right? Of course, there's always been fact-checking in journalism, and you have to, make sure that the facts in your story are correct before you publish. But fact-checking in the sense of a kind of story which is dedicated to saying whether something somebody said or something that's circulating is true or false, and especially organizations that specialize in doing only that, like Verificat here in Barcelona, or like Maldita in Madrid, or like F Verifica, parts of news organizations or sometimes civil society organizations that only do this. That's only 20 years old, and it's something that started just as a kind of contagious idea. There were sort of a few in the mid-2000s, and then there were a few dozen by 2010, and then by 2020, sort of at the height of the pandemic, which was kind of when the peak was, there were more than 400 different fact-checking organizations in more than 100 different countries around the world. So really, initially, this grew first in North America and Europe, but it spread globally very quickly. And it's really changed along the way. So the biggest turning point was, of course, it was already growing, but after 2016, when suddenly there was this global alarm over what are the effects of fake news, did it explain Brexit? Did it explain Donald Trump being elected? Does it drive this, waves of right-wing populism that we see from the Philippines to France to Argentina? There's so much alarm over fake news. Suddenly there was much more money for fact-checking from technology companies and from foundations, and so it just exploded after 2016. And it's worth mentioning, I will get to the question eventually, but it's worth mentioning that the really big turning point was when fact-checkers offered to help Mark Zuckerberg solve his fake news problem. And amazingly, Mark Zuckerberg said yes, because he wanted something to say. This is at the end of 2016. He needed something to say in Brussels and in Washington when he was being asked, why aren't you taking disinformation seriously? So he started paying fact-checkers all around the world to identify misinformation on Facebook and later Instagram and WhatsApp. And that really drove the growth of fact-checking tremendously, but it also fundamentally changed what fact-checkers were doing. So at the start, it was mainly about keeping politicians honest, right? It was about sort of public discourse, like debates and speeches and newspapers, about political accountability. And then 10 years later, it's almost entirely about this wider fight against the societal problem of misinformation. And so fact-checkers really work in different ways today. So they partner with technology companies. They use AI tools themselves to help identify sort of, very quickly if a fake story is appearing again and again and again. Or for instance, Maldita has an AI engine that they built in-house, Maldita in Madrid, that helps to identify what are the bigger narratives that emerge across thousands of fake posts, right? So they use that strategically so they know where the misinformation is going and how they can respond. And of course, if we could talk about this more, but suddenly fact-checkers are really focused on changing policy. right? So maybe the best way that we fight misinformation is by coming up with smart rules in Brussels for how to govern platform companies, how to make new rules for information accuracy. And so, you know, as specialists in these questions, they've really tried to shape that sort of political landscape, that policy landscape.
That would be for another debate, how to make rules and then have difficulties to apply them. But that would be for another debate on the EU. We are really against the clock, I'm told, and I would like to get some questions, but I would like to ask you, just before we take some questions.
I'll be very quick.
Maybe it's too general, but can we ever get rid of disinformation, or everything that we are explaining, it's just a portrait of this new reality that we will have to cope with?
So, I mean, there's, you know, maybe we can keep talking about this in the questions, but of course, the short answer is no, right? Saying, how do we get rid of misinformation, is like saying, how do we eliminate crime or poverty or any other sort of widespread societal phenomenon? But of course, we can make a difference, you know, and since the earliest days of fact-checking, since the mid-2000s when it appeared in the United States, there would always be, after every election, there would be a whole flurry of news articles and opinion pieces that would say, what difference did fact-checkers make? You know, like, why does fact-checking matter if politicians keep lying and they keep getting elected? Nobody cares. But that's the wrong test, right? We don't ask that of other kinds of journalism, you know, to make sure everyone is perfectly informed, or to make sure that every investigation, you know, makes sure that the criminals go to jail. I mean, sometimes they don't. But we know that the effort is worthwhile. And I think the most important thing that fact-checkers do is that they help to validate all of the sources that they rely on, all of those institutions that they use, all of the experts and the statistical agencies and the legitimate news outlets, all of the information that they draw on to check facts comes from that institutional world that is exactly what we need to protect today, right? I think that's the most important change, and that's the way that we have to try to solve this. I mean, not solve, but...
The importance of reliable sources, and that's at the core of journalism, in fact. Hi ha preguntes des del públic? Tenim l'oportunitat? Sí, gràcies.
Gracias. Thank you, Lucas, for such an interesting introduction in something that is so huge and impossible to discuss. I know we're against the time, so I will be very brief, but still I have two questions. The first one, I wanted to ask you if you believe or if you feel like the inappropriate use of artificial intelligence, and as a probable result of that, disinformation and misinformation, could be one of the causes why we have a war in Europe, or is it just a coincidence that we are having a war in Europe and there is a rise of artificial intelligence use? And second question, very brief, because I'm really curious. You mentioned the peer review that you are doing, that you are conducting. I wanted to ask you if you are using any AI to help yourself to do the peer review. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is the question, you know, we're all asking ourselves sometimes, right, as we watch. We're always wondering how our peers are using it and what's appropriate, what's not. So to the first question, I always shy away from sort of asserting causality, right? It's really difficult to say that we wouldn't have had the war in Ukraine, for instance, without these new forms of disinformation. But, you know, it is now a part of the landscape, and it is how war is conducted, right? It's the nature of propaganda today, the nature of information warfare today. So it is a feature of the national security environment, and it is a weapon of war, and it's quite effective, right? And it's only going to increase in importance. So it's not a coincidence, is what I'm trying to say, even though, you know, who knows what would happen in another world where we didn't have these technologies, or where disinformation didn't develop the way that it did over the last 10 years. I know that's not very satisfying, but it is built into the political world and the world of international affairs today, and so it matters. You know, it's very consequential. And clearly in the case of the wars that Russia is prosecuting, for instance. On the question of how I'm using it, I mean, I really struggle with that, so the rule that I have is I don't use it to, you know, to write anything for myself, but sometimes I'll ask it silly questions to see what it comes up with, or to test what answers students might give to an essay that I assign or something. And it's very frightening when it has a pretty convincing answer, you know. I think the kinds of assignments that I like to give are especially vulnerable to some automatic essay writing machine that is good at sounding smart, even though sometimes the ideas aren't there, you know. So the truth is, I'm still figuring out how I'll use it in my day-to-day work. You know, sometimes when I want to just check a fact, I debate whether to go to a search engine or, you know, or try an AI first and get a really quick answer. And of course, this is the biggest threat to journalism today in general, right? You know, what are media organizations going to do, as they don't have all of these references from search traffic? But I sort of debate that with myself, even when I'm, you know, when I'm looking for information. So yeah, I'm figuring it out. I don't know how. I'd love to hear how you're using it.
I always thought that this fear of the blank page is very fruitful. So with AI, we are killing that. Tenim temps per una pregunta més. Ui, veig dues mans. Si podem agrupar les dues, com que abans hem fet dues de cop, agafem dues.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas, for your words.
No, no passa. I can translate. No problem.
Thank you, Lucas, for your words. We are journalists. I would like us to be critical with our work. So, speaking about AI, a few days ago, there were a video, a political video with Silvia Riols, which is the leader of a Catalan extreme right party, shooting the ex-president Puigdemont. So this video and this meme was disseminated also by a lot of media. So was it necessary? How do we handle it? Because I remember the trumpet of disinformation from Karel Wardeland and First Draft. So disinformation and hate speech starts in WhatsApp, in Telegram, but then all this is disseminated by the media. So Jody Cantor said, we don't have a collective plan to save the truth. Do we have a journalist collective plan to save the truth? Thank you.
I don't think we do.
We take the second one, and then, I'm sorry, but you will have a minute and a half to wrap up for both of them. Sí, sí.
It's said that fake news spreads twice faster than their verification. So I was wondering, in which ways could fact-checking be applied in our daily life so that, for example, the youth, which we inform through social media, essentially, so that the truth comes faster to us than fake news?
Okay, so those are both great questions. To the first one, this is such a crucial point because it raises, I think the most important question that journalists are struggling in this era, not only of fake news, but also of politicians who lie in ways that seem sort of new, right? Or at least with a frequency that seems sort of new. The question of when not to report something, right? When not to give oxygen to the fake information, even if you're challenging it, even if you're negating it. That's the most difficult thing for journalists to do, you know, and again, it applies whether we're talking about a fake video produced like that or the one that, the AI video that, you know, showed Trump defecating on the protesters. I mean, as a journalist, how much air do you give to that? Because you're just increasing its influence, right? But at the same time, it demands to be covered. And I think, I've thought for a long time that this is a skill, this is a reflex that journalists need to develop. And it's something fact checkers struggle with, right? So they will not check something if it isn't already at least going viral a little bit, right? Because they know that when they check it, they're also amplifying it. So there's always this question they have to ask themselves, and I think that, again, that's a skill that other journalists need to use. When it comes to how we can make the truth as attractive as very entertaining lies or fake videos, if you figure it out, let me know. But that is something actually that fact checkers work on. So instead of writing long articles that nobody reads, they make Instagram posts, or they make short, entertaining videos also that they try to distribute. And then, of course, the biggest intervention they can make, and more fact checkers are moving this way now, is through things like media literacy, right? Through information literacy, so that it's not just about competing with the lies, but it's about giving people the training and the skills so that they know what is not likely to be true, right? I mean, that's the most important way that we can prepare our society for the deluge of crap that we find ourselves surrounded by.
Hello to Lucas Graves. Thank you very much for this crash talk on a huge challenge. Thank you very much for being with us today.